August 5th, 1192. The merciless Palestinian sun beat down on the limestone walls of Jaffa as Richard Plantagenet, King of England and self-proclaimed Sword of Christendom, gazed across a tactical situation that should have marked the end of his legendary career. From the harbour where his 35 remaining ships rode at anchor, the Lionheart could see Saladin's banners stretching across the coastal plain like a dark tide of silk and steel. 20,000 of Islam's finest warriors had converged on this strategic port city, their scimitars glinting in the heat haze that rose from sand already soaked with Crusader blood. Richard commanded exactly 2,000 exhausted men, including just 54 knights still capable of mounted combat, and a handful of war horses that had survived 3 years of brutal campaigning. The mathematics were beyond hopeless. 10-to-1 odds against the greatest military mind in the Islamic world, fighting on ground of Saladin's choosing with an army that had just achieved its greatest strategic victory of the Third Crusade. Picture this impossible trap as it had developed with the surgical precision that marked Saladin's tactical genius. While Richard had been securing Acre, 80 miles to the north, the Sultan had struck Jaffa with lightning speed, overwhelming the Crusader garrison through a perfectly coordinated land and sea assault. The port city that served as the Crusaders' primary supply base for any advance on Jerusalem had fallen in 18 hours, its defenders scattered or dead, its warehouses full of grain and weapons now feeding Muslim armies. Richard's entire strategic position in the Holy Land hung by the thread of this single coastal fortress. The loss of Jaffa represented more than tactical defeat. It was strategic catastrophe that threatened to unravel 3 years of Crusader gains. Without this port, Richard's army would be cut off from European reinforcements and supplies. The overland route to Jerusalem, which had seemed within reach after the victories at Acre and Arsuf, now became logistically impossible. Worse, Saladin's capture of Jaffa had scattered the Crusader coalition that Richard had spent months assembling. French contingents had already begun embarking for home, convinced that the campaign was doomed. German knights who had followed Frederick Barbarossa to their deaths in Anatolia were abandoning the crusade rather than face certain annihilation. But here's what Muslim chroniclers couldn't explain about Richard's response to this disaster. Any rational commander would have negotiated terms, secured safe passage for his remaining forces, and retreated to Acre to minimize losses. The strategic situation was hopeless. The tactical odds were suicidal. Even Richard's own nobles advised immediate withdrawal rather than risk the total destruction of English military power in a futile gesture. Yet the king, who had earned his reputation through 3 years of impossible victories, was about to attempt something that defied every principle of medieval warfare. Richard's forced march south from Acre revealed both the desperation and the determination that had made him the most feared Christian warrior in the Levant. His army moved at a pace that killed horses and broke men, covering 80 miles of hostile territory in 48 hours, while under constant harassment from Saladin's scouts. Knights rode double when their mounts collapsed. Infantry discarded armor they could no longer carry. The baggage train, slowed by wounded and supplies, fell 20 miles behind the main force and was never seen again. By the time Richard's banners appeared on the hills overlooking Jaffa, his army resembled refugees, more than the elite force that had terrorized Muslim armies from Cyprus to Cairo. The arithmetic of desperation revealed itself as Richard surveyed Jaffa's defenses through his brass spyglass. 20,000 Muslim warriors occupied not just the city, but the surrounding hills, their cavalry patrols controlling every approach route. Saladin himself commanded from a silk pavilion whose golden eagle banner could be seen from the harbour. The finest siege engines in the Islamic world were already positioned to prevent any relief attempt. Most critically, the garrison that might have supported a rescue operation had been eliminated. Richard would have to retake a fortified city defended by overwhelming force, using troops who could barely stand from exhaustion. The strategic stakes transcended even Richard's legendary reputation. If Jaffa fell permanently to Muslim control, the Third Crusade would end in complete failure. Jerusalem would remain in Islamic hands forever. The Crusader states established during the First Crusade would wither and die, cut off from European support. Most importantly, Christian morale throughout Europe would collapse under the weight of knowing that even Richard Lionheart couldn't overcome Saladin's tactical genius. As evening fell on August 5th, both armies understood that the next 24 hours would determine not just the fate of Jaffa or the Third Crusade, but the entire balance of power between Christianity and Islam in the eastern Mediterranean. Richard faced a choice between certain defeat and almost certain death. What he chose would either crown his legend with the greatest victory in Crusader history, or provide Saladin with the triumph that would complete Islam's reconquest of the Holy Land. The mathematics said retreat was the only rational option. Richard's response would prove that sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who understand when mathematics become irrelevant. Dawn on August 6th revealed the tactical nightmare that Richard had chosen to embrace rather than flee. Saladin's army sprawled across the coastal plain in perfect order, their white and green banners snapping in the Mediterranean breeze, as 20,000 warriors prepared for what should have been a massacre disguised as a siege. From the harbour, where Richard's 35 galleys bobbed at anchor like floating coffins, the sight was overwhelming. Muslim cavalry patrols controlled every beach approach, while archers lined the city walls in such density that their arrow volleys could darken the noon sky. The port that had taken Saladin's forces 18 hours to capture would have to be retaken by a force 1/10 their size, with no element of surprise. But Richard had spent the sleepless night transforming his apparent disadvantage into something medieval warfare had never witnessed, an amphibious assault designed to turn the Mediterranean itself into his most powerful weapon. His ship's carpenters had worked through darkness to reinforce galley sides with additional planking, creating floating fortresses that could approach the beach while protecting crossbowmen from return fire. The innovation was born of pure desperation, but it represented a tactical revolution that would influence naval warfare for centuries. Medieval combat was about to become three-dimensional. The first challenge was basic physics made deadly by enemy arrows. 60 knights wearing 70 pounds of mail each would have to wade through surf, while under concentrated fire from Muslim archers positioned on Jaffa's seawalls. The weight that made their armour effective on land became potentially fatal in water. A single crossbow bolt finding its mark could drown a knight as efficiently as it could kill him. Richard's solution was characteristically audacious. The ship-based crossbowmen would provide suppressing fire, while the knights used their shields as primitive flotation devices during the wade to shore. As the sun reached its merciless peak at midday, Richard's galleys began their approach to Jaffa's harbour with a precision that amazed both friend and foe. Each vessel carried 40 Genoese crossbowmen whose accuracy had been perfected through decades of Mediterranean warfare. Their steel-tipped bolts could penetrate mail at 100 yards, making them lethally effective against Muslim defenders whose lighter armour emphasized mobility over protection. The psychological impact was immediate. Defenders accustomed to fighting land-based enemies suddenly faced attack from an angle they had never prepared for. What happened next defied every assumption about medieval siege warfare. As Richard's lead galley grounded in the shallows, Muslim archers unleashed clouds of arrows that should have turned the water crimson with Crusader blood. Instead, the reinforced ship sides deflected most shafts, while crossbow volleys from the remaining vessels systematically cleared sections of the seawall. The exchange rate was catastrophically favourable to the attackers. Muslim archers, exposed on the walls, suffered devastating casualties, while Crusader knights remained protected until the moment of actual landing. Here's where Richard's tactical genius became visible through the chaos of amphibious combat. Instead of attempting a single massive landing that would concentrate all his forces at one vulnerable point, the Lionheart coordinated simultaneous assaults at 3 different beaches. Muslim defenders, expecting to overwhelm a concentrated force, found themselves facing multiple threats that divided their attention and firepower. Units rushed to defend one landing site, left other approaches virtually unguarded. The wade through the surf revealed why Richard commanded such legendary devotion from his men. The king himself led the central assault, his distinctive golden surcoat making him an obvious target for every Muslim archer within range. Knights who had served under lesser commanders would have hesitated at the water's edge, calculating their chances of survival. Richard's men followed him into the Mediterranean without question, their shields locked above their heads, like scales on some mythical sea monster emerging from the depths. By 3 p.m., the impossible had become reality. Crusader knights were fighting in Jaffa's narrow streets, while their comrades continued landing on beaches that should have been killing grounds. Muslim defenders, caught between seaborne assault and their own tactical confusion, began falling back toward the city centre. The urban geography that should have favoured defenders, narrow alleys, stone buildings perfect for archery, instead became a maze, where heavily armoured knights could corner and destroy lighter-armed opponents in close combat. But then, everything accelerated toward crisis. Saladin's main force, positioned outside the city walls, began their counterstroke with the methodical precision that had made the Sultan master of Syria and Egypt. 20,000 fresh warriors started moving toward Jaffa's gates, while Richard's exhausted knights fought building by building through streets slick with blood. The mathematical reality was undeniable. Even if Richard captured the harbour district, he lacked the forces to hold it against Saladin's inevitable counterattack. The amphibious miracle that had achieved the impossible was about to collide with strategic mathematics that made ultimate victory seemingly beyond reach. The race between Richard's urban conquest and Saladin's approaching relief force would determine whether this desperate gamble would be remembered as brilliant innovation or spectacular suicide. As Muslim war cries echoed from the approaching army, both sides understood that the Third Crusade's fate hung in the balance of the next few hours. Saladin's counterattack began at sunset on August the 6th, with the overwhelming force that had conquered Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo. 20,000 warriors converged on Jaffa from 3 directions simultaneously, their war cries echoing off the limestone walls as the greatest military mind in the Islamic world prepared to crush Richard's amphibious miracle through sheer mathematical superiority. The Sultan had spent precious hours allowing the Crusaders to establish their beachhead, but his patience was strategic rather than indecisive. By waiting until his full force could coordinate, Saladin ensured that Richard's tactical innovation would meet systematic annihilation rather than piecemeal resistance. Richard's response revealed why 3 years of brutal campaigning had forged him into something more dangerous than a mere warrior king. Instead of attempting to hold Jaffa's sprawling defences with his tiny force, the Lionheart concentrated his men in the harbour district, where his ships could provide continuous fire support. Using materials salvaged from captured Muslim siege engines, his engineers transformed the waterfront into an improvised fortress that maximized every advantage medieval technology could provide. Ship anchors became foundation stones for hastily erected barricades. Iron chains intended for harbour defence were repositioned to trip cavalry charges. Most ingeniously, galley masts were converted into elevated platforms for crossbowmen who could fire down at attacking infantry. The first Muslim assault struck Jaffa's makeshift defences like a bronze-tipped tsunami crashing against a seawall built from desperation and tactical genius. 8,000 infantry, supported by 5,000 cavalry, thundered toward Richard's position with the confidence of warriors who had never failed to overwhelm numerically inferior enemies. The sound was beyond human comprehension. 13,000 men charging across limestone pavement while screaming prayers that promised paradise to those who died killing Christians. Defenders who had never faced such concentrated fury should have broken and fled toward their ships within minutes. But here's where medieval engineering met strategic desperation in ways that would influence fortress design for centuries. Richard's improvised fortifications channeled attacking forces into narrow approaches where numerical superiority became meaningless. Muslim infantry found themselves advancing through corridors barely 10 feet wide, while crossbow bolts erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. The harbour district's irregular layout which had seemed chaotic and indefensible, became a maze where small groups of heavily armoured knights could hold choke points against hundreds of attackers. The exchange rates became immediately catastrophic for Saladin's forces. In the first 30 minutes of assault, Muslim casualties exceeded 400 dead, while Crusader losses numbered fewer than 20. At point-blank range, Genoese crossbows could punch through mail, leather and bone with mechanical precision that made individual skill irrelevant. Muslim warriors, accustomed to the fluid cavalry combat that had dominated Middle Eastern warfare for centuries, found themselves trapped in grinding infantry battles where their mobility advantages disappeared. Modern military historians recognize this phase of Jaffa as the birth of integrated combined arms defense. Richard had created something unprecedented, a fortress that could move its artillery, adjust its fields of fire, and coordinate land and sea forces in real time. When Muslim attacks concentrated on one section, galley-mounted crossbowmen could reposition to provide enfilading fire. When cavalry attempted to outflank the land-based defences, ship-based archers could rake their formations from unexpected angles. The harbour that had seemed like a trap became Richard's greatest tactical asset, but Saladin wasn't simply throwing men against prepared positions. The Sultan, who had outmaneuvered Richard at Hattin, was systematically probing for weaknesses while building pressure that would eventually exceed defensive capabilities. Muslim engineers began constructing mangonels within range of the harbour district, their stone projectiles designed to collapse Richard's improvised fortifications through concentrated bombardment. More ominously, Saladin's cavalry had begun interdicting the beaches where Crusader supplies and reinforcements would have to land. The psychological pressure on Richard's defenders was becoming unbearable. Each assault wave grew larger and more coordinated. Muslim arrows fell in such density that movement between positions became potentially fatal. Worst of all, the mathematical reality was inescapable. Saladin could afford to lose 10 men for every Crusader casualty and still achieve overwhelming victory. Richard's tactical innovations had bought time and inflicted casualties, but they hadn't changed the fundamental arithmetic of the siege. Then came the intelligence that would force both commanders to gamble everything on one decisive action. Muslim spies reported that a Crusader relief column was approaching from Acre, though its size remained unknown. Saladin faced the nightmare scenario that had haunted his strategic planning, fighting Richard's entrenched force while simultaneously dealing with external reinforcement. The Sultan, who had spent 3 days methodically grinding down Crusader resistance, now had to choose between patient siege warfare and immediate decisive assault. The stage was set for the kind of desperate gamble that creates legends or destroys them. As dawn approached on August 8th, both Richard and Saladin understood that the tactical maneuvering had reached its limit. What happened next would determine not just Jaffa's fate, but whether Richard Lionheart would be remembered as the greatest Crusader commander or the king, whose desperate innovation led to catastrophic defeat. The mathematics of medieval warfare were about to collide with individual genius in ways that neither side could predict or control. The dawn of August 8th brought the moment that would either immortalize Richard Plantagenet or mark his final defeat at the hands of the greatest Muslim general in history. Saladin had spent the night positioning his entire army for what he knew must be the decisive assault. 20,000 warriors formed a crescent around Jaffa's harbour district, their scimitars catching the first light as drums echoed across the limestone walls with rhythms that had terrified Christian armies from Hattin to Ascalon. The Sultan himself took position where he could observe Richard's destruction, confident that overwhelming numbers would finally crush the tactical genius that had frustrated Islamic conquest for 3 brutal years. Richard's response defied every principle of defensive warfare that had governed medieval combat since Hastings. Instead of waiting behind his improvised fortifications for the Muslim assault, the Lionheart gathered his 54 remaining mounted knights in the harbour square and prepared for something that military historians still consider the most audacious tactical decision in Crusader history. 54 heavy cavalry would charge directly into 20,000 enemy troops across open ground with no possibility of retreat. The mathematics were beyond suicidal. They were mathematically impossible. But here's where Richard's understanding of medieval psychology transcended mere tactical calculation. The king, who had studied Saladin's methods for 3 years, understood that Muslim morale depended on the assumption of inevitable victory through superior numbers. A charge that should have resulted in instant annihilation might instead create psychological shock that could shatter enemy cohesion before numerical superiority became decisive. It was a gamble that staked everything on the power of individual courage to overcome mathematical certainty. The charge began at precisely 7 a.m., with a sound that seemed to crack the very foundations of Jaffa's limestone walls. 54 destriers, each weighing over 1,500 pounds and carrying a knight in 70 pounds of mail, thundered across the harbour square towards Saladin's amazed army. Their 12-foot ash lances, tipped with steel points designed to punch through any armour, couched in perfect formation, as Richard himself led the wedge that would either achieve the impossible or provide Saladin with the most spectacular victory in Islamic military history. The impact was beyond human comprehension. 54 knights, moving at 25 miles per hour, struck Muslim infantry with the kinetic force of a medieval avalanche. Lance points found their targets with mechanical precision, while 1,500-pound war horses trampled everything in their path. The front ranks of Saladin's army simply disintegrated under impact forces that medieval engineering had specifically designed to make unstoppable. In the first 30 seconds, 200 Muslim warriors lay dead or dying, while not a single knight had fallen. Richard himself became the focal point of combat that reached mythical proportions. The king, whose golden surcoat made him visible across the entire battlefield, carved a path through enemy ranks with sword strokes that contemporary chroniclers described as superhuman. Muslim warriors who had conquered from Baghdad to Cairo found themselves fleeing from a single mounted figure whose blade seemed to be everywhere at once. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. If Richard Lionheart could not be stopped by overwhelming numbers, what hope did mere mortals have? The rout began within 17 minutes of the charge's initiation. Elite Muslim units that had never retreated in their lives suddenly broke ranks and fled toward the hills surrounding Jaffa. The mathematical impossibility was becoming historical reality, as 54 knights systematically destroyed the cohesion of an army that outnumbered them 370 to 1. Saladin watched in growing horror as his carefully coordinated assault dissolved into panic that spread through his ranks like wildfire through dry grass. What Saladin witnessed next challenged every assumption he held about the relationship between numbers and victory. As his cavalry attempted to rally and surround Richard's tiny force, the Crusader knights didn't scatter as tactical doctrine demanded. Instead, they maintained formation and continued their advance, cutting through successive lines of Muslim resistance with mechanical precision that made their small numbers irrelevant. Each knight was accounting for dozens of enemies while suffering casualties that could be counted on one hand. The climactic moment came when Richard's charge reached Saladin's command position, forcing the Sultan himself to flee from a battlefield for the first time in his legendary career. Muslim chronicles would later claim that Saladin withdrew to maintain strategic perspective, but eyewitness accounts describe a panicked retreat as the commander who had humiliated the finest Christian armies found himself personally threatened by a king he had considered defeated. Within 1 hour of the charge's beginning, Saladin's entire army was in full retreat toward Damascus, abandoning equipment worth a kingdom's ransom, and leaving behind casualty figures that defied belief. 700 Muslim dead against 2 Crusader losses. The army that had seemed destined to complete Islam's conquest of the Levant was fleeing in panic from a force that could have fit into a single church. As Muslim banners disappeared beyond the horizon, Richard had achieved something that violated every principle of medieval warfare. individual genius had triumphed over overwhelming numbers through the kind of desperate courage that creates legends or destroys those audacious enough to attempt the impossible. The question now was whether tactical brilliance could be translated into strategic advantage, or whether even perfect victory could overcome the mathematical realities that governed medieval conquest. The Third Crusade's fate had been decided by 54 knights, who proved that sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who understand when mathematics become meaningless in the face of perfect timing and absolute courage. As the dust settled across Jaffa's blood-soaked harbour, the impossible mathematics of Richard's victory became starkly visible in the afternoon light. 700 Muslim warriors lay scattered across the limestone ground, their bodies forming a grotesque testament to what 54 heavy cavalry could accomplish when desperation met perfect tactical execution. Against this oceanic loss, Crusader casualties numbered exactly 2 dead. A sergeant-at-arms struck down during the initial charge, and a knight who had fallen from his wounded destrier during the pursuit. By any measure of medieval combat effectiveness, Jaffa represented the most lopsided victory in recorded military history. The immediate toll on Richard's tiny force revealed both the triumph and the tragedy of tactical perfection achieved at strategic impossibility. Knights collapsed from their saddles, their mail so dented from impacts that squires required hammers and chisels to remove the armor. War horses that had carried their riders through the charge stood with heads lowered, their flanks heaving from exertion that had pushed the 500-pound animals beyond the limits of equine endurance. Most critically, Richard himself showed signs of the physical and psychological exhaustion that 3 years of constant campaigning had inflicted on even the strongest constitution. The treasure abandoned by Saladin's fleeing army revealed the extent of Muslim confidence that had been shattered by Richard's charge. Siege engines worth 10,000 bezants lay scattered across the plain, their crews having fled so precipitously that they abandoned equipment representing months of skilled craftsmanship. Persian carpets, silk pavilions, and silver vessels littered the battlefield like debris from a merchant caravan rather than spoils from a military disaster. Most tellingly, Saladin's personal banner, the golden eagle that had flown over Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, remained planted in the ground where the Sultan had abandoned his command position. Here's what the victory really cost Richard beyond the minimal battlefield casualties. His army, reduced to fewer than 800 effective fighters after 3 years of attrition, lacked the numerical strength to exploit tactical success strategically. Jaffa had been saved, but Jerusalem remained 35 miles away, across hostile territory controlled by Muslim garrisons that could be reinforced faster than Richard could advance. The port that had been recaptured through tactical genius still couldn't serve as the launching point for the campaign that would complete the Third Crusade's objectives. The psychological transformation among both armies would echo through decades of Crusader-Muslim warfare. For the Christians, Richard's charge had proven that individual courage and tactical innovation could overcome any numerical disadvantage when properly applied. Young knights who survived would spend their careers attempting to recreate Jaffa's success, often with catastrophic results against enemies who had learned from Saladin's mistake. Veterans understood they had witnessed something unprecedented, a battle where medieval cavalry had achieved its theoretical maximum effectiveness against prepared infantry. But the Muslim perspective reveals why Saladin's withdrawal marked him as a strategic genius rather than a defeated commander. His army remained intact despite losing 700 elite warriors to an impossible tactical reverse. More importantly, the Sultan had learned something invaluable about the limits of Crusader capabilities. Richard could win perfect tactical victories, but he lacked the resources to translate battlefield success into strategic conquest. The campaign for Jerusalem had ended not in Christian triumph, but in mutual exhaustion. The diplomatic consequences became apparent within days, as both commanders began exploring the peace negotiations that would define the Third Crusade's legacy. Saladin, despite suffering his most humiliating military defeat, retained control of Jerusalem and the strategic initiative throughout Palestine. Richard, despite achieving tactical perfection, faced the reality that his army was too small to sustain further offensive operations. The victory that had seemed to validate Crusader military supremacy actually demonstrated the impossibility of European conquest in the Levant. Richard's decision in the aftermath reveals the strategic wisdom that elevated him above mere battlefield brilliance. Instead of pursuing Saladin's retreating forces or attempting an immediate advance on Jerusalem, the Lionheart chose to consolidate his position and open diplomatic channels. The king, who had achieved the impossible at Jaffa, understood that sometimes perfect tactics must yield to strategic reality. As evening fell on August 8th, messengers rode toward both Damascus and Acre, carrying news that would reshape the political landscape of the eastern Mediterranean. Richard had saved the Third Crusade from total disaster, but he had also proven that even tactical genius couldn't overcome the fundamental limitations imposed by logistics, geography, and medieval military economics. The greatest cavalry charge in Crusader history had achieved everything except the strategic victory that would have justified its legendary status. Jaffa had become both Richard's crowning triumph and the monument to everything the Third Crusade could never accomplish, no matter how perfectly its battles were fought. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed on September 2nd, 1192, marked the end of the Third Crusade with terms that reflected the strange equilibrium Richard's impossible victory had created. Saladin, despite suffering his most humiliating tactical defeat, retained control of Jerusalem and the strategic centers of Muslim power throughout Palestine. Richard, despite achieving tactical perfection that would echo through military legend, departed the Holy Land without accomplishing the primary objective that had brought him east 3 years earlier. The agreement granted Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem's holy sites, while acknowledging that the city would remain under Islamic rule indefinitely. The strategic revolution that followed. Jaffa rippled across medieval Europe as news of Richard's charge spread through courts from London to Constantinople. Heavy cavalry tactics, which had been evolving gradually since Hastings, suddenly crystallized around the model of concentrated shock action that had shattered Saladin's army. Military treatises, written in the following decades, analyzed the precise formations, timing, and psychological factors that had made 54 knights capable of routing 20,000 infantry. The charge doctrine that would dominate European warfare for centuries traced its theoretical foundation to that August morning when mathematical impossibility became historical fact. But here's what military academies still struggle to teach about Jaffa's deeper significance. Richard's victory represented both the pinnacle and the limitation of individual military genius in an age when strategic success required resources that no single commander could provide. The tactical innovations that saved the Third Crusade from total disaster also revealed why Crusader states could never achieve permanent conquest in the Levant. Perfect battles couldn't overcome logistical realities, demographic disadvantages, or the simple arithmetic of sustaining European armies thousands of miles from their supply bases. The cultural consequences extended far beyond military doctrine into the realm of legend and literature that would define medieval identity. Richard Lionheart became the archetypal Crusader king, his reputation enhanced by victories that grew more spectacular with each retelling. Troubadours across Europe sang of the impossible charge, while chroniclers transformed tactical success into moral triumph. Yet this legendary status obscured the strategic limitations that had made even perfect victory ultimately meaningless. The king who could defeat any army couldn't overcome the mathematics of medieval logistics. Richard's personal fate revealed the cruel irony that attended even his greatest triumph. The king, who had achieved tactical immortality at Jaffa, was captured during his return journey, imprisoned by Leopold of Austria, and died 7 years later, besieging a minor French castle over a dispute involving buried treasure. His death ended the line of Plantagenet military genius that had terrorized Muslim armies, while Saladin's legacy endured through the Ayyubid dynasty that continued controlling Jerusalem for decades. Saladin's response to Jaffa demonstrates why defeat can sometimes prove more valuable than victory for commanders capable of learning from adversity. The Sultan spent his remaining years developing the defensive innovations and diplomatic strategies that would make future Crusader victories impossible, regardless of their tactical brilliance. Muslim military doctrine evolved to emphasize economic warfare, strategic patience, and the systematic exploitation of Crusader logistical vulnerabilities. The lessons learned from Richard's charge ensured that no future Christian army would achieve comparable tactical success. The deepest lesson of Jaffa transcends its immediate military context to reveal something fundamental about the relationship between individual achievement and historical possibility. Richard's charge proved that perfect courage, flawless timing, and tactical genius could overcome any numerical disadvantage when circumstances aligned properly. Yet the same victory demonstrated that even impossible achievements must operate within strategic constraints that individual brilliance cannot transcend. Modern historians recognize Jaffa as the moment when medieval warfare reached its theoretical limits. Heavy cavalry had achieved maximum effectiveness against prepared infantry. Amphibious assault had been perfected centuries before. Naval doctrine would catch up, and individual leadership had overcome mathematical impossibility through sheer audacity. Yet none of these innovations could solve the fundamental problem that made Crusader success temporary. European armies, fighting Asian wars, could win every battle and still lose every campaign. Think about what this means for understanding the relationship between tactical genius and strategic success. The most perfect military victory in Crusader history became the monument to everything the Third Crusade couldn't achieve, despite fighting with legendary skill and impossible courage. Individual brilliance had met systemic limitations and discovered that some problems cannot be solved by better tactics or greater heroism. August 5th, 1192. Richard Plantagenet faced mathematical impossibility with 2,000 exhausted men against Saladin's 20,000 warriors, fighting for a strategic objective that logistical reality had already made unattainable. When the bronze dust settled over Jaffa's limestone harbour, the Lionheart had proven something that would echo through every generation that followed. Sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who understand that impossible odds exist to be overcome by perfect courage, flawless execution, and the kind of desperate brilliance that transforms tactical genius into timeless legend, even when legend cannot change the fundamental mathematics of history itself.